So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Settlement, Slavery, and Empire, British Colonial Rule in the Caribbean, which is sponsored by Adam Matthew Digital. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. So all the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We're using the Q&A feature today, so please use it to ask questions of our presenters. We do expect many questions and we likely won't have time to get to all of them, so we apologize in advance for that. But that being said, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. So please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you throughout the presentation. Also note that there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also note that we're recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we're ready to get started. So I'll pass things over to Sophie.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Yes, hello everyone. So I'm Sophie Seddon. I'm a development editor at Adam Matthew. So I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm going to begin by introducing today's panelists. So just a quick note before we begin that unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Heather Catto from the University of West Indies, who we had initially hoped to interview for this webinar, is unable to join us today, but we're really excited to be sharing a section of one of our video essays by Dr. Christy Warren, and we're also thrilled to have Dr. James Dawkins, who's joining us here live. So just to quickly introduce the panelists, we've got a recorded video from Dr. Christy Warren, who's a research associate at the University of Leicester. So Christy is previously worked on cataloguing an outreach project at the National Archives based in Kew, which concerns the original Colonial Office correspondence sent by the governors in the Caribbean between 1718 and 1926. So this is how we came to find her for this resource. She recently completed a PhD in sociology at the University of Warwick, and her thesis, A Colonial Society in a Post-Colonial World, Bermuda and the Question of Independence, interrogated how colonial past informs contemporary political debate. So just a quick note that Christy isn't available with us live to respond to questions. And then we also have Dr. James Dawkins, who is a research fellow at the University of Nottingham. So James's work focuses on tracing and studying the socio-economic, political and commercial connections between Britain and its former West Indian slave colonies during the 18th and early 19th centuries. He's also engaged in research which identifies and publicly acknowledges the significance of enslaved African labour to the industrial, institutional and cultural development of modern Britain. And then finally, there's me. So I am a development editor at Adam Matthew Digital, and I've been working with the company since September 2018. So I've just been here 3 years. So I've overseen the development of Colonial Caribbean, which has kind of contributed to the growth of our long-running East India Company resource. So Colonial Caribbean is actually my first project to be published under the company. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really wonderful to see this resource. I spent so much time putting it together, it gets so much interest. So thank you. Just to provide you then just a bit more information about the resource itself. So Colonial Caribbean is based in 3 modules. So today we're kind of looking at the first, but just to show you what they'll look like. So you've got module 1, which is Settlement, Slavery and Empire, which is 1624 to 1832. You then have module 2 coming next year, which is Colonial Government and Abolition, 1833 to 1849. And then the third module, which will be Economic Change and Indentured Labour, 1850 to 1870. So my role in this project was actually to structure the modules into the shape that you see them in today, which is using the expertise of the editorial board and collaborating with colleagues at Adam Matthew and the National Archives here in the UK. So these 3 modules will cover 25 islands in the Caribbean. These stretch from Jamaica and the Bahamas to St. Lucia and Barbados, And it presents an opportunity for the academic field to study slavery from prominence to abolition in the wider context of British colonial rule in the West Indies. So the resource details the regular running of trade and shipping to island council meetings, various legislation and bills, prison records, building plans, all amongst the fierce rivalries with the Spanish, Danish and French powers in the Caribbean region. There's considerable key themes here. We had things such as absentee landlords and estate ownership, crime and punishment, finance and the economy, trade and shipping, law and governance, mutiny and piracy, plantation governance, maintenance and labor, religion, slavery, abolition and emancipation, uprising and revolts, and of course, war and the military. So generally from these resources, you'll be able to study the overall administrative running of the Caribbean islands that were part of the British Empire. There are also some foreign language documents in Spanish, French and Dutch, which show how certain islands, such as Guadeloupe, fell in and out of hands of different powers over the earlier period in Module 1. So now that I've taken you through that, I'm really pleased that we're going to show you a demo now. So this was put together by my colleague, Erin Pearson, who worked on the production of putting this resource together. So this video is going to take you through that now.
Hi everyone, my name is Erin Pearson and I'm a senior editor here at Adam Matthew. I was the production lead for Colonial Caribbean and I'm going to give you a demo of the site today. This is our website for Colonial Caribbean, Colonial Office Files from the National Archives UK. This resource brings together materials sourced from the National Archives in the UK and has been split into 3 separate modules. This is the first module that has published in September that we're looking at today. Across the top of this website, we have a navigation bar, which includes standard sections of our sites, including introduction, view all documents, browse documents, research tools, a searching guide, and a link to our help site. And I'll take us through each section of those briefly now. We also have a few quick links on the homepage to get started straight away. Within the introduction, we have a number of pages including nature and scope, which gives a brief overview of the material and includes some information about the topics that are covered by this resource, as well as some information on the browsing tools that we've included as well. We also have a selection criteria page, which lists out all of the file classes or series from the National Archives that are included within this resource. And we have a language and terminology page. This includes some background on the language that's used throughout this material. These documents are colonial in nature and so of course contain phrases and terms that are outdated now and offensive as well, and so we wanted to include some background information about those terms. Within this resource, we've also included metadata that was compiled by the National Archives throughout the late 19th century, and so this metadata itself is also historical and therefore can contain some outdated language. We have an essay from Dan Guilfoyle at the National Archives UK to provide some background on the documents and also on the metadata as well. We wanted to also include a point about language and terminology in reference to Indigenous peoples as well, because of the way that the Indigenous peoples are referred to throughout these documents. There's a short blurb as well under introduction to just clarify the different modules as well. So module 1 is entitled Settlement, Slavery and Empire and dates from 1624 to 1832. So all material included within this resource are dated within that time period. Module 2 and 3 will be publishing later as well. If we then go to view all documents, this is where it's possible to see all of the documents included within the site. We have 1,759 documents within Module 1, and this portal will be added to when we publish Modules 2 and then 3. It's possible to simply click into the documents from here, or you can also use the filters on the side to narrow down the documents that you see. So we have a date filter, you can filter by series, by colony, by theme, you can filter by document type, or by language as well. We have some headline information for each document. So the metadata that shows here allows you to get a sense of what this document is about without having to click into it further. So this document entitled Demerara and Essequibo 1809, we have the reference CO11-1/9, the date, the colonies that relate to this document have been tagged, and the themes that relate to this document have been tagged. The themes just give a general sense of what the document relates to overall, and we also have the series CO111. We also have some browsing tools available within this site. We really wanted to ensure that we were supporting users through this site and enabling people to find the material that they were interested in. We know that seasoned researchers who are familiar with this material will be very familiar with the series and file class structure at the National Archives. And so browse by series allows people who are familiar with, say, Jamaica, and they'll know CO137 relates to Jamaica. This page enables users to go directly to the series that they're interested in. So this returns a filtered list, filters by the series CO137, and so this is everything that is within series 137 within module 1. So we have 182 documents. We were conscious though that undergraduates or people coming to this material perhaps for the first time may not be as familiar with our series and file structure at the National Archives. And so we've included browse by colony as another option. So this enables users who are perhaps less familiar with the series but are more focused on a particular geographical region, a particular island or area. It enables people to get into the material in that way. So here we have Jamaica, say again, as a colony. Again, that returns a filtered search, filtered by Jamaica, and we have 309 documents that have been tagged with the colony Jamaica versus the 182 that were within the file class for Jamaica. We then have browse by theme. All of the documents within Colonial Caribbean have been tagged with a theme in order to give an indication of generally what the document covers. We put together our themes in collaboration with our editorial board to ensure that they are reflective of current research and current academic study in order to make them as useful as possible. Finally, in this section, we have browse by governor. So this page lists out each British Caribbean colony. So there are some colonies that are included within Colonial Caribbean that were administered by French or Spanish powers instead of British. We have here listed out each governor of each colony with their dates in office, their title, and some information about them. It's also possible to click and search for all references to this governor or browse for documents relating to this governor's tenure. The reason that we wanted to include this information is because the administration of these colonies was so central to the documents within this site, and this enables users to get a better sense of what the power structures were within colonial governance in the Caribbean. So if we click to search for references to Francis Willoughby, this link returns search results for Francis Willoughby. So we can see there are 4 documents that have search results for Francis Willoughby within them, whereas this link is a browse link, which enables us to browse for documents that relate to Francis Willoughby. So this link returns a filtered list, filtered by the colony Barbados and the dates between which Francis Willoughby was governor. And we only have one hit where we might find some material related to Francis Willoughby included within this document. Continuing along the tabs, we included a research tools section within this site. We have various different guides to, again, provide context and support our users through this material. We have a guide to colonies, which includes short written passages summarizing the history of each colony. These are really quite brief, but just intended to provide some background and some context for users, particularly those who are new to this area of study. And once again, we have similar functionality where you can browse all documents relating to Barbados, or you can search for all references to Barbados. We also have thematic guides, which are intended to support and provide context and background to the themes that we've selected for this resource. We have essays and video interviews from our editorial board in order to highlight and provide some context on some of the key themes found within this resource. We also have a visual gallery. This highlights the more visual material within the resource, and users can look at all of the visual material within the resource by clicking View All, or can look at a dedicated map gallery. Also within this section, we have an editor's choice where members of the editorial team have written short narratives of interesting documents or stories that they found within the source material, as well as a chronology in order to situate the user within the historical context of the time period covered by colonial Caribbean. Finally, within the navigation, we have a searching guide. This provides more information and support on how to search within colonial Caribbean. Very excitingly, colonial Caribbean has had handwritten text recognition technology applied to all of the documents within the site. This means that a user can perform a site level search and hits will be returned within individual documents, which really makes this large scale manuscript resource so much more searchable. There's also just some more information about how this works, how this interacts with accessibility standards, and how users can find out more about the HTR for use within data mining as well. So as an example, we perform a search for, say, Governor Morris. And if we look at this first document, the first of 28, we can see there are 68 hits for Governor Morris within this document. So we can see the first hits are within a printed document, but the rest of the hits appear within the manuscript pages within this document. And if we click on this hit, Governor Morris is highlighted where his name appears on this page. So this is a really exciting feature that opens up all sorts of possibilities for researchers using manuscript material for their research. Just a few other things to note in terms of the document details page that we're looking at now. All of our documents have a summary tab, which includes some headline information and metadata. If you've performed a search, the hits will always appear at the bottom underneath the image viewer. We also have document details, which is just more metadata associated with this document. And finally, I just wanted to highlight that most of our documents have been split into sections in order to make them more granular and easier to navigate through. So an example of a document which has this is here. So you can always find the sections by clicking Browse Sections, and this document has been split by month of correspondence of Sir P. Ross. Those are all of the key features of Colonial Caribbean. This has been a huge project to work on. It's been such a privilege to have the opportunity to work on it, and I really hope that you all enjoy exploring it further. Thanks, everyone.
So yes, that has hopefully given you all a flavour of the site and how we put it together, and the sort of contextual content that we've developed to provide you with all that additional information, particularly to help students and researchers utilise these documents beyond the usual scope. and particularly the essays, of which we're actually now going to play you the video essay from Christy Warren. So I will again leave you to listen to her expertise.
Hello, my name is Christy Warren. I'm a historian and sociologist, and I study the transatlantic histories of people of African descent, especially concentrating on the Caribbean and Britain from the late 18th century to the present. I'm interested both in these histories and the legacies that they present to us today. It's important to question the narratives presented in colonial documents because, as Michelle Rowe-Trio notes, sources and the archive are neither neutral or natural. They're created by people, just like you and me. Joan Swartz explains that archives are not passive storehouses of old stuff, but active sites where social power is negotiated, contested, and confirmed. In other words, archives are not without a history of their own. They were formed during specific times and by particular people for defined reasons. Trio also explains because archives are created, we cannot simply talk about what is present and what is absent, but also what has actively been silenced. Silences have a dynamic of their own. They're created as much as the printed words. Such silences were created by both the conscious and unconscious elevation of some knowledge and the decrease and dismissal of other kinds of knowledges. In deciding what to record, officials also consider the impact of the recorded information on the state. This kind of filtering process is also conducted after the documents reach the archives, where the decision of what to release and what to withhold from the public is made often on considerations of how it will affect the state and those who serve the state, especially those who are still living. Therefore, the creation of silences is an exercise of power. The colonial archives thus not only contains information about the violence of colonialism and slavery, but are themselves part of the process. Largely, they determine what we can know about Indigenous people, the enslaved, indentured, and their immediate descendants. That this knowledge comes through recordings made by their oppressors means we must question the ways that Indigenous people, the enslaved, indentured, and their descendants are represented. This is especially the case because when such people do appear in the records, it is most often for contravening the colonial order or because of some injustice done to them. It is thus in the interest of those keeping the records to show how much of a threat they are to this order. In response to the issues the archives poses around the lives of the enslaved, Saidiya Hartman engages with the concept of critical fabulation. She explains that in seeking the lives of the enslaved, it's not possible to recover them, but rather that what's possible is to imagine what happened around the edges of what's recorded in the archive, and also to listen really closely for what she calls the mutters and oaths and cries that can be heard to help us think about these histories in ways that disrupt current discourses. So critically engaging with these documents means thinking about what we spoke about in the last question. So we need to look at the repositories, not just what we can get out of them, but we must also think about these power relations that I've spoken of. We need to think about the social and political climate in which documents were produced, preserved, and analyzed, and that also impacts how we come to analyze them and engage with them. As Anne-Laure Stoller noted about the archives more generally, we need to read for its regularities, for its logic of recall, for its densities and distributions, for its consistencies of misinformation, omissions, and mistakes along the archival grain. So by reading with the grain, the researcher is reminded of what Stoller says is the power of the production of the archives itself. It's necessary also to consider what information is not prominent in the archive and what's missing altogether, therefore. The question arises about whose viewpoint is voiced and who is silenced. And that's where we can engage both with reading with the grain and reading against it. Both of those processes are important. Pointing out that the archives are partial is not an attempt to dismiss them totally, but rather to reorientate the way in which we approach the sources. The archive must be approached as an institution created partially to maintain power through the control of knowledge, rather than as an unquestioned source of the truth. And I think very few people approach it as an unquestioned source of the truth today, but this is the history of the archive that we must remember. When approached in this manner, the archives has much to tell about how rulers maintain their power and how their oppressed either resisted it or found ways to survive it. Using the archives allows researchers to add to the existing narrative. Many of those who have used the archive in the past have done so within a framework that allows certain ideas to be made prominent while others remain obscured. Such histories were written with presumptions of what kinds of information should be valued and which was not important. So we can think about how traditionally histories of everyday people in many countries weren't seen as valuable, that we thought about the great and the good only. This is also something that shifted in the last few years, decades. Using archival sources is thus important for creating fuller narratives of society. It can be used well if it is approached with an understanding of its constitution, which makes it possible to recognize both its value and its limits. As we'll explore more detail later, it's important to combine researching the use of the Colonial Office records as we're doing now with the use of other sources, repositories, and methods. So one of the things I always suggest when looking at and covering accounts of enslaved people and free people of color, as they were known then, in the colonial documents, I suggest looking for good examples of research that's already been conducted on this subject, and increasingly we have quite a bit more. One example I'd like to give is a history workshop article by Christina Fryer called The Narrative of Anne Pratt, Life Writing, Genre, and Bureaucracy in a Post-Emancipation Scandal. This article explores a pamphlet entitled 7 Months in the Kingston Lunatic Asylum and What I Saw There, which covers the experiences of Anne Pratt, who is described as a mixed-race Jamaican woman, and it's of the several months she spent in that institution. The article explores how, and I quote, the bureaucratic practices of collating and filing that colonial governors used produced a more powerful edition of the pamphlet, one that primed the Colonial Office for a positive reception of Anne Pratt's case. So we can see how the process of recording and the ways in which the Colonial Office processed information was also part of the process on how certain cases were received. So if we think through the Colonial Office records as well, there are a number of records that are more likely than others to have information about enslaved and free people and the indentured as well. Some of those types of records that are especially useful are commissions of inquiry. This is often when an individual was sent out from Britain to a colony to assess something that was felt to have gone wrong, often in a colonial institution. Court records, reports on institutions, so going back to the Commission's reports, but these would be more annual reports, the things that were done more methodically. And we're thinking here of institutions such as asylums, prisons, orphanages. We get some insight of the types of people that were kept in those spaces, which was often those who were the least advantaged in society. Also, the general correspondence that was sent back, which makes up the majority of the Colonial Office files, often had enclosures where questions may have been asked about specific issues concerning things such as the condition of slavery and indenture and rates of population. And lastly, consider petitions. So petitions would have been sent in the Colonial Office records most often to Parliament or to the Secretary of State, but often sometimes there would be more personal kinds of petitions that were found. And these weren't always in the original correspondence from the governor, but would have been found in the sections from officers and individuals as well. So next we'll look at a couple of examples of petitions from Bermuda and St. Kitts.
There we go. So that was a fantastic video there from Christy, and I can't stress enough how it's been really a valuable element of contextual information, and particularly to also assist in looking at these documents in a different way to perhaps we would have done before. Something at Adamathi we've been trying quite hard over the last year to interrogate the ways in which we can make a difference to the hidden narratives that are often forgotten that actually exist within these documents. So that was a fantastic piece of information to be able to utilize people using this resource. And on that front as well, we're going to now pass you on to another of our essayists, so James Dawkins, who contributed to the resource. But as he's here with us, I'll move on and allow him to take us through.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Sophie. Sophie, if you could just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Great stuff. All right then. Hello. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Hope that you can all hear me and also see the slides on my screen. So let's get started. If you could move along to slide 2, please, Bill. Great stuff. Thank you. So, as I'm sure that most of you will agree, the Colonial Caribbean database, it's a very useful resource that can help us to develop a clearer sense of this region when it was under British colonial rule. And in addition to its wealth of digitized records, it also contains, as Sophie said, essays and interviews, as you've just seen, which provide readers with a useful context and also entry points to further explore the wealth of data contained in the collection. I'm the author of the paper titled The Dawkins Family, Transatlantic Slavery and the Development of Modern Britain. And you can find my essay amongst the essay and video interview section on the Colonial Caribbean Collection website. And I'm just going to provide a brief overview of my written piece, its importance, and also an example of how I've been using the Colonial Caribbean Connection to gain a deeper understanding on the lives of my enslaved African ancestors. So the subject of my essay derives from my doctoral research, which focuses on the slave owning history of the Dawkins family, with whom, as you probably guessed, I share the same surname. And that's because the existing evidence suggests that they are the family who owned my foreparents in Jamaica. More specifically, my paper highlights the Dawkins' strategic use of colonial money to throw light on the various sectors of Britain. So that's to say education, politics, economics, along with its built environment that were enriched by and also developed from the profits of slavery. Now, each societal area that I speak about in the essay, it's supplemented with brief examples of other slave owning families who also spent their money in a similar way to the Dawkinses, therefore pointing to the larger concentrations of colonial wealth flowing into 17th, 18th and early 19th century Britain. My essay also discusses the modern day legacies of the Dawkins slave ownership before summarizing and really pulling together the importance of their colonial activities. And I situate my writing within the historic literature, and most notably the work of Eric Williams, whose seminal text, Capitalism and Slavery, really illuminated the numerous areas of British society that benefited from the colonial Caribbean in the period of transatlantic slavery. So, who were the Dawkinses? Well, the Dawkins were a white English family originating from Leicestershire in Middle England over here. And several of its members, including 2 men, Richard and William, migrated to Jamaica shortly after the English seized the island from the Spanish in 1655. And from 1660 onwards, the monarchy awarded land to individuals and families such as the Dawkinses who were willing to migrate to the island, settle there and establish plantations, pens that cultivated cash crops such as sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice and pimento. Now, the first three generations of the Dawkinses really concentrated their efforts on building up a vast plantation complex. And by 1744, just 80 years after they'd initially arrived on the island, they possessed 10 sugar estates covering approximately 25,000 acres of land, a labour force of over 1,300 enslaved Africans, and also financial capital totaling £100,000. And this made them one of Jamaica's wealthiest slave-owning families in the mid-1700s. And with their riches, they decided, as did many other wealthy British slave-owning families, to move to England, where life was more comfortable and where they could focus on transforming themselves into members of the elite ruling class. Now, the family departed from Jamaica in 1759, and they left their plantations and their pens, their estates, and enslaved labourers in the hands of attorneys, overseers, and drivers. Now, these people ensured that sugar continued to be cultivated on the Dawkins estates, and most of that was then ensured that it was transported back to England or to Britain, where it was sold, and it was the profits from that that were sent to the Dawkinses' bank account. Now, this setup of the Dawkinses in England and their estates in Jamaica, it remained so until the legal termination of slavery in 1833. So that's to say that the Dawkins family became what's known as absentee slave owners, and they lived the rest of their lives in England, feeding off of the profits of my enslaved ancestors, produced by my enslaved ancestors. So British society benefited from, well, sorry, that's the other question. So how did British society benefit from the colonial Caribbean? How did this family benefit? Well, the Dawkinses, the wealth, British society benefited from the Dawkinses' wealth that was produced by enslaved African people in a number of ways. And one of the examples I'd like to give, and that I also highlighted in my essay, is how the Dawkins family paid expensive tuition fees for the education of at least 4 generations of its sons at England's most elite educational institutions, such as Eton College and the University of Oxford. So between the early 1700s and early 1800s, these institutions absorbed thousands of pounds. Today, it would be millions, which contributed to their upkeep, administration, expansion and governance. And that money was received obviously through the Dawkins family paying, these costly tuition fees. However, they're not an exceptional family either. There are many other slave owning families who migrated back to Britain and spent their African produced fortunes on attending England's most prestigious schools, colleges and universities, with often more than one generation appearing at these places of elite study. These families include the Beckfords, the Codringtons, the Fullers, the Gladstones, the Lassells, the Longs, the Morants, the Pennants, the list goes on. And so my paper really points in this respect to the fact that these educational centres of study have a long history of receiving vast sums of cash that derived from the transatlantic slave economy. So Bill, if we could just go forward to slide 3, please. Thank you. So the importance of this research: case studies of this nature are really important for a number of reasons, and there's 2 or 3 here. The inhumane and barbaric nature of chattel slavery and the broader transatlantic slave economy over here in Britain, and I'm sure in the United States as well, it really evokes feelings of deep national shame and guilt, particularly amongst its white population. And consequently, British institutions and the wider white public have sought to distance themselves from this by narrating a history that celebrates the nation's abolition of slavery, by playing down its significance as a driver of modern British development and also industrialization, or by just ignoring it altogether. And this approach to dealing with this period of Britain's past is extremely offensive to people of African descent, such as myself, as it actively and purposefully refuses to acknowledge the instrumentality and the significance of African people's labour, which produced the considerable proportion of the financial and material wealth that facilitated Britain's social, economic, its cultural, and its industrial development. So my research really challenges this orthodox self-congratulatory narrative, with the essay clearly documenting areas and suggesting the broadest, clearly highlighting areas and suggesting the broader scale of the nation's enrichment and development from the wealth produced from African enslavement. Secondly, the study of the Dawkinses is also important as it humanizes the history of slavery. And this appears more so in my doctoral thesis than in the essay that I've written for the Colonial Caribbean. However, it moves from, so this humanizing of slavery is really important because there's a movement from a generalized account of talking about enslaved people as simple, or African people as simply the enslaved, to naming individuals of African descent who were held captive on the Dawkinses plantations and whose labor created the wealth that this particular family used to finance their education at Britain's elite educational institutions. Now, personalizing the history of slavery is significant as it restores humanness to African people who have, for so long, been objectified and spoken about as a faceless cohort, which has made their exploitation and devastation and suffering more bearable for Britain's white population and its institutions that are deeply connected to the transatlantic slave economy. Moreover, case studies like this on the Dawkins family are a part of truth-telling and reconciliation, which are key elements of the broader process and idea of reparations or reparative justice, pushing Britain towards an admission and acceptance of responsibility for the damage and destruction that was inflicted on African people and the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean, the contemporary legacies of transatlantic slavery, and also the need to address these vestiges in a sincere, meaningful, and sustainable manner. Bill, if we could just move forward to the last slide, please. Thank you so much. So just finishing up, I'd like to say that those of you who have read my essay or who will read my essay, or are even interested in reading my essay, you'll notice that it focuses on the Dawkinses, the areas of British society which their wealth flowed into. But my doctoral thesis and work subsequent to that really pays attention towards and to the daily working lives of the African people enslaved on the families, the Dawkinses estates in Jamaica. And this is a really important part of my study, which I'm deeply passionate about. However, and Christy touched upon some of this, one of the biggest challenges confronting me and other researchers pursuing this line of study is the lack of information on enslaved African people in the colonial office records, and just records that were composed during the period of transatlantic slavery. The majority of historical counts that exist only speak about or refer to the enslaved Africans as it within the context of property. So a name, you'll be able to find out their name, their age, their gender, their location, and their status of health. But apart from that, there's not much else said on them. And the Colonial Caribbean collection has been a really a great help to me, And using its advanced search engine, I've been able to retrieve some key sources, which you'll see on the slides there, that provide additional information on my ancestors enslaved on the Dawkins' plantations. Now, one of those documents that I obtained, it details, it's the larger one of the three. It's a document that details a marriage between an enslaved man called Edward Flowers and an enslaved woman called Juliana Davis in 1826. And they were enslaved on two of the Dawkins' plantations, one called Sandy Gully and one called Parnassus. I've also been able to retrieve a newspaper advert that names an individual called Gusta, who ran away for one of the Dawkins' plantations in 1780. And the bottom manuscript, it's the long rectangular strip at the bottom of the screen of my slide. That is a manuscript, or part of a manuscript, that lists an enslaved man simply named as Thompson, who was tried in a so-called slave court in Jamaica in 1817 for running away. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to transportation to another colony. Now, these documents, plus several others, are really helping me to piece together the backgrounds and the key activities in the lives of my ancestors, who had, until, you know, these documents have been looked at and having me kind of write about them, they've been forgotten. And so they're assisting me with the narration of African, a narrative that speaks to African agency, the determination amongst the enslaved to forge families, as you just heard through that marriage, that manuscript that documents the marriage of two enslaved people, along with stories of resistance and also attempts to escape slavery. So the manuscripts, I mean, I think it's also important to point out that they're instrumental in providing me with official documentation and evidence that acknowledges my ancestors' existence, which prevents them from being erased from history. The Colonial Caribbean collection is an extremely helpful resource, and I'm really looking forward to drawing on the records that it contains for further support with regards to the development of my research. Thank you all for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Thanks, Sophie. Great demos and videos and presentations. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so I just encourage our attendees, if you have any questions, to please send them in through the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. Let's see. We have a couple open.
Yeah, there's a couple here. Shall I go ahead and answer, read them out and answer?
If there's a certain one that you'd like to touch on first, you can
so
go
the
for
first
it.
one, so the first one that I've seen that relates to my work is by Jordan Sly, and Jordan asks, James, do you feel, or well, he doesn't say James, but he says, do you feel as though a database like this, which flattens and makes more immediate the dense archives, may help to clarify the debate over the analysis of Williams and Dunn? In other words, it seems like with examples like yours, you push way more into Williams. I need to have a think about that. That's so do I feel like the data which flatten makes more immediate the dense archives? I think, let me come back to that one. Sorry, I need to, that was a bit, I'm struggling to answer that one.
Yeah, it looks like we have a couple questions for Sophie, so maybe we can get to those
Sure.
first, and then there's a question here from Heather that says, what is the accuracy level of the handwriting technology?
So we do get this one quite a lot. So we actually don't have actual percentages of accuracy. The reason being that there are variables in how it works. So this can be dependent on writing style and orientation. But it is a really impressive piece of technology. It does return some really good results. Aaron demonstrated in the demo there that pretty much when you type in most of the governors, it will recognize particular names that will come up. I have used it myself, and it's pretty much always come up with exactly what I've been looking for every single time I've done it myself. So I hope that is a really good example to use there. But yeah, so like I said, it just depends on certain variables of particular writing and the orientation and things like that. But yeah, generally a really good piece of kit.
Great.
Okay, thanks so much, Sophie. So I'm going to try and answer Jordan's question. Do I feel as though the database like this, which flattens and makes more immediate the dense archives, may help to clarify the debate over the Williams and analysis of Williams and Dunn? I think that the database, I think that the Williams, at least, yeah, I think that Williams's argument is extremely complicated, and I think that the database will go some way to helping resolve some of the key contention. Well, no, not resolve, that's not the right word. I think that the database will go some way to providing more insight that can contribute to the resolution of some of Williams's key contentions, but I don't think that it will help to it won't resolve them, but it will contribute to the resolution of them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think we do have another quick one for Sophie, maybe. So these documents are OCR'd, asked Margarita.
Yes, so that's correct. My understanding is they're OCR'd. Obviously HTR as well where it actually recognizes particular words and characters. So I would say just generally, yes. I'm not sure what more I'm able to add on that front. But if if there's any further questions, we're welcome to get back. We can always ask with a colleague that has more information and get back to you.
Great.
Can I? There's a question from Trevor Bernard. Can I answer that?
Sure. Yeah. Let's do that.
So Trevor's asked me, one of the Dawkins family was very important in establishing the study of antiquity through the Grand Tour. How do we balance the good things that enslavers did with the things that they did that were bad, especially when the good things were financed by the bad? That's a really difficult. That's really difficult to do. I mean, I can speak specifically on this particular individual that Trevor's asking about. His name is James Dawkins, and personally, in his instance, I don't think that how do we balance the good and the bad? I think that it's about acknowledging both. So the history that's been written on James Dawkins at the moment talks about him as a leading 18th century taste maker and an explorer and an antiquarian. And whilst this may be true, and he may have contributed to a cultural and artistic architectural renaissance in 18th century Britain, I think it's important to acknowledge alongside that where the wealth came from that allowed him to go on those that financed those exhibitions. And so I think, because at the moment it's very out of balance, you hear these stories of people doing fantastic and wonderful things, that's really pushed out there, it's popular, but where the wealth came from to finance that it's not spoken about. And I think that having the contextualizing, or at least having some acknowledgement of where that came from would help to balance things. You don't want things too much one way on the fantastic things that James Dawkins may have done, but then and not speak about or acknowledge where the finance came from, which was the exploitation of African people. But in the same time, you don't just want to paint him as a slave owner and there's nothing else to him, because he's a multi-dimensional people. So I think, just finishing up, I think it's really about contextualizing these people within a kind of like more broadly, and showing that they have, I guess they've got multiple dimensions to their personality, good and bad. It's about providing a balanced argument. Sorry, a balanced narrative. Sorry, that's a really long answer.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think we have one here from Nicole that says, thank you for this informative presentation. One, when will the next modules be available? And two, can search engines be downloaded onto a CSV file or other form?
So yeah, I've noticed actually this is coming up quite a lot. So the first module is obviously currently available now. The next two are then in consequent years. So the second module will be next year, and then the third module the year after that. So that's the availability of the modules. I don't have the specific month yet, but that should be one a year. And then in terms of downloading, so when you actually come to the document page, there is actually a download button. So you can either download the metadata, which comes as like an Excel sheet, or you can actually download the document as a PDF. So I hope that answers that question on that front.
Great. Yeah, I think we have time for one quick one. Maybe looking ahead, Erin asks, what will be covered in the second and third modules? Maybe we can get a preview on that.
Yeah, so the way that these three modules have been structured is, I guess that like the first module covers the very early period where you have a lot of these battles between the big powers at this point, and the fight for land, and then the early settlement of all people colonizing the region. So the second module is is when the abolition, the bill comes in, but there's this period of apprenticeship where technically those who were enslaved are not actually freed for another good decade. And it kind of demonstrates this period where the colonial government is still running things and people who are enslaved are still actually not technically being made free, even though it's technically from 1833 in law. So it's more of like, it represents that weird in between. And then the third module actually represents when those who are enslaved are actually, well, the logic is freed, but it's then looking at the financial decline or the beginning of that decline, and then those coming across from India and other colonial British colonized regions. So the structure has kind of been done in this particular way as well, because these documents encompass so many different administrative departments within volumes. So trying to do it on an events timeline of that basis is certainly how we've tried to structure this. So there's kind of a taste of what's coming up, but the thing is that you'll just have every possible different administrative function that will appear across these two modules, and very similar themes across because of the nature of this material. And I think that's also what just makes all three of these modules just so interesting, and the way that actually it was run at this point. So yeah, I hope that's answered that question as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have hit 3 o'clock, but we do save all of these questions. So hopefully maybe we can send answers back to people, because some really great questions are coming through. So thank you so much to Sophie and James for presenting today. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. We hope you learned something from the session, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar.
Yes, thanks so much, Sabrina. Thanks everyone. Sorry for my I was a bit flustered and overwhelmed at the format. Sorry I didn't answer the questions as best I can, but thank you so much for everyone kind of posing them and listening. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks so much.
much.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.